welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share 5 crawler stories I came across on the internet. These stories include an account from a soldier who saw eyes in the woods that were accompanied by a pungent stench, a white figure sprinting across the road with inhuman speed, followed by a second encounter with a guttural scream, and one of these creatures entering a campsite in Canada. Sightings of these often described tall, lean, pale creatures are on the rise, and, just like other cryptids, the encounters happen all over the world. Of all the cryptid stories I read and recreate on this channel, I have to say that the crawler stories are some of the creepiest by far. Alright, on to the first story. Our first story in this episode comes to us from Ruidoso, New Mexico. Ruidoso is a village in Lincoln County. It is a mountain resort town located in the Sierra Blanca mountain range in south-central New Mexico. The original poster, or OP, was stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. He and 2 of his friends decided to head up to Monjo Peak outside of Ruidoso for a 3-day camping trip on Memorial Day weekend. Monjo Peak is located in the southern part of the Sierra Blanca range. The peak reaches an elevation of 9,641 feet, or 2,939 meters, and is best known for the stone observation tower at its summit. It is a popular destination for camping, hiking, and climbing. The OP and his friends arrived at Monjo Peak, parked, and hiked up to their campsite, which was approximately 30 to 40 feet above where they parked and about 300 square meters as described by our OP. They were one of 3 groups that had arrived for the weekend. The first 2 nights passed without incident, other than the fact that they found bones scattered across the campsite upon their arrival on the first day. The bones looked to be from various animals, and there were enough littering the campsite that the OP and his friends took notice. Fast forward to the 3rd night of their trip. To this point, it had been a relaxing one, but that would change on this night. The sun had long since set and the campsite sat in darkness, and the woods sat completely silent. The OP is unsure how long the eerie quiet had settled on the area before he and his friends mentioned it to one another, but not long after they noticed, his hair stood on end. He was then covered in goosebumps and noticed that his friends were fidgety and seemed nervous. One of the other 2 groups they were sharing the campsite with was a couple who had 2 dogs he described as happy and relaxed. On this night, though, they were going crazy barking. The unsettling silence had encompassed the entire area, which included the other 2 campsites as well. It didn't take long for the group of 3 soldiers to decide to head down to the car, which was about 60 meters from their campsite, and retrieve their firearms. On their way back up to camp, they were hit with a horrible, pungent stench. The OP describes it as burnt feces mixed with death. It was so overpowering it felt like it physically hung in the air. Something wasn't right and they knew it. Upon their return to camp, they decided to have a guard posted throughout the night, with each of them taking turns. The OP volunteered for the first shift because he knew he wasn't going to get any sleep that night anyway. Luckily, they had plenty of wood for the fire that would get them through the night, so no one would have to leave camp at any point. The OP kept the fire going, keeping it as big as possible to deter whatever was out there from entering their camp. He sat with his back to the fire so his eyes would stay adjusted to the dark, watching the tree line. Just beyond the tree line was a steep drop-off that wouldn't be the hardest hill to traverse, but it wasn't an incline you would want to try to navigate at night. It was when he was looking in this direction that he saw a white shape amongst the trees. It stood in stark contrast to the rest of the dark woods. He thought he was looking at a tree partially obscured by another one, but when he scanned the tree line with his flashlight, he saw the light reflected in eyes when he got to the white shape. Before he could really see what it was, and just as his eyes were registering what it was he was looking at, whatever was out there disappeared behind a tree. His first instinct was to go check it out, but he thought better of that and instead decided to wake up his friends. They scanned the woods together but saw nothing. When his shift was over, he took the rainfly off his tent to improve his line of sight should he need to see anything outside. But his time at rest was uneventful. During his next shift, he didn't see anything, but the putrid smell persisted. As dawn approached and began lighting the campsite, the smell faded but did not completely go away. He perceived the lingering smell as a warning left by the creature he saw the night before. As they packed up camp and prepared to leave, he asked the couple with the dogs if they ever settled down after they stopped barking. The owner said they didn't, that they spent the entire night whining and growling while watching the same incline where the OPs saw the white shape and eyes. He left the campsite that day not knowing what he saw the night before. But he does note that whatever he saw looking at him was not human, as our eyes do not give off the same kind of reflection when light is shined on them. I included this story with crawler stories because the OP, while answering questions in the comments, says he saw the creature on an incline, but doesn't think it was any taller than an average human. This, to me at least, leads me to believe it was a crawler. If he thought this thing was taller than a normal person or much taller than a normal person, I would think it was something else. The smell and the whiteness of the creature could point it to being a Wendigo, but they are usually described as much taller than humans. That made me think crawler when I heard this story. What do you think it was? Our next story comes from a poster who has 2 separate posts detailing his 2 encounters with a crawler. He believes it could be the same one. He doesn't say where exactly he lives, just that he lived near some woods during his first encounter and was 17 or 18 years old. When he learned about humanoid creatures, the rake in particular, he developed a quick fascination with them and would always share stories and watch horror movies with his friend, who he also introduced to humanoids. His friend would come sleep over often, and they would watch scary movies or videos before going out into the woods at night to see if they could encounter anything themselves. On the night they did have an encounter with what they believe is a crawler, they went about their usual routine and headed into the woods after midnight. They came to a spot where the path split and took the path leading off to the right, which led up a hill. It took them approximately 15 minutes to reach the top of the hill, where they followed the path back down and ventured onward about 10 more minutes before coming to another crossroad in the path. The path leading left would take them out of the forest, and the one going right would take them to another hill. They went right, would periodically stop at the beckoning of his friend and stand in complete silence, listening for anything that might be nearby. They would also scan the trees with their flashlights. They saw and heard nothing. About 30 minutes later, our OP was getting cold and tired. Being that they hadn't seen or heard anything, he was ready to go home. His friend reluctantly agreed, so they turned and started heading back down the path that would lead them out of the woods. Having not encountered anything the slightest bit creepy, they relaxed on their return trip and their conversation moved on to other interests. When they reached the second crossroad, his friend froze and asked if he saw something come from their right and head down the path ahead of them. The OP had a habit of looking at his feet when he walked, so he saw nothing. He thought this was another attempt from his friend to try to build tension, as was typical of him during their late night excursions, and he didn't believe him. His friend started throwing rocks down the trail ahead of them in an attempt to provoke whatever he thought he saw into reacting. But nothing happened. They stood there for a few minutes watching and listening, but again, nothing. In fact, there was no noise at all. This brought about an uncomfortable feeling upon our OP and his friend. They eventually started back along their path and had just about reached the first split when he shined his flashlight into the trees not far in front of them and saw 2 yellow dots. The closer they got, the more they realized they weren't dots. They were eyes. Not just yellow eyes watching them, but a bald head as well. He stopped in the path and pointed the thing out to his friend, who did not see it at first, but when he did, the boys started freaking out as the realization came over them that whatever they were looking at was between them and the nearest exit from the woods. As the boys began to panic, their voices grew louder, not knowing what to do. The head disappeared behind the tree and promptly reappeared on the other side. The boys followed its movement with their flashlight and watched the creature step back from the tree and slowly walk away on 2 legs. The being had a slender body and was a whitish grayish color. It stood approximately 2 meters or 6.5 feet tall, hunched over, its arms hanging down by its side. They stood there for a few moments after this thing disappeared into the woods looking for any sign of the creature, but they didn't see anything. The boys took off running as if their lives depended on it and did not stop until they reached the OP's house. It was the scariest thing either of them had ever experienced. Looking back, the OP believes that this thing either followed them through the woods without making a sound, or it somehow knew what path they had taken so it could position itself to see them on their way back out of the woods. He also notes that it recognized pretty fast it had been spotted and believes it switched from one side of the tree to the other to see if the boys would follow it with their light. He also states that this creature was not scared of them at all. This is common in most cryptid encounters I come across. These things show no fear of us, almost like they know they could overpower us in an instant if they wanted to. But many times, as in this instance, they just turn and leave. What he came across that night certainly seems like a crawler by the way he describes it. What do you think he and his friends saw that night? In his second post detailing his second encounter with what he thinks might be the same crawler, the OP from the previous story gives us some more detail about his first encounter. Not far from where they encountered the supposed crawler is a dried up riverbed with multiple cave entrances. He can't help but think that the crawler might have made a home in these caves deep down. However, he does say that they look more like normal fox burrows, even though he has never seen a fox in this area, having lived there 21 years. He does go on to say that while they were running out of the woods after seeing this creature, he felt the distinct uneasy feeling like he was being watched. But what is way more alarming was the fact that he felt like he was being hunted. His second encounter took place at his home, which, at least to me, is even more disturbing than coming across something in the woods. It had been 4 years since his first encounter, but he wonders if this is the same crawler he saw back then and if it somehow found him. One commenter suggested that these things can pick up a scent and track people. The OP recalls a story he heard where a hunter believes this happened to him, as the crawler he encountered one night spent a lot of time near a tree he had leaned on earlier that day. He says that if this is the case, if the crawler did somehow pick up his scent and track him, it would be his personal nightmare. I'm sure that would be true for most of us. Now, on to his description of his second encounter. He was up late one night, as he usually was, being that he was a night owl, and his window was open to let in some fresh air. Out of nowhere comes a sudden, aggressive shriek and clicking sound from right under his window. It was unlike anything he has ever heard before, and there is no sound or scream he could even begin to compare it to. He immediately thought back to the crawler he encountered in the woods 4 years prior. The thing that scared him the most that night was that the scream came from right under his window, which was on the second floor. It seemed to him that it was done on purpose, with the intent to challenge him. He was frozen in fear, unable to bring himself to move for about 10 minutes. A short time later, he heard noises coming from his carport, like someone was stepping on metal plates or something metallic. He confirmed in the comments that there were metallic objects in the carport, like a ladder, gardening tools, a bicycle stand, shovels, and a large metallic plate they used to move wood. He did not sleep that night. Taking everything into consideration and assuming this is the same crawler, he ponders why it would let them leave the woods 4 years prior, only to come find him at his home years later and act aggressively. He seems to think that it wanted to let him know it was still there and it knew where to find him. This is what led him to believe it might have his scent, as he stated in response to a comment. He also feels like it wanted to mock him and assert its dominance. I remember a story I did about a girl from Australia who had many encounters with a crawler in different homes and locations over the course of a number of years. It certainly seemed like she was being stalked by that creature, so this could be the same situation this person is facing. I, for one, hope that's not the case and these are two unrelated incidents. What do you think? Is it the same crawler? Could it have picked up his scent in the woods that night? Our next story comes to us from near Sacramento, California. Sacramento is the capital of California and is located in the northern half of the state. It is the 6th largest city in the state and the 9th largest capital in the United States. The greater Sacramento area is home to more than 2.6 million residents. The documented encounter took place 4 years ago in the surrounding area at night at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. The original poster had just gotten off work, but she wasn't ready to go home, so she pulled over just before turning into her neighborhood. To her right stood homes from the neighborhood, and to her left a field and trees. As she was sitting there, she noticed something come out of the neighborhood about a quarter mile up the road. There was a park close to where the creature emerged. It looked to her to be about 7 to 8 feet tall, was extremely skinny to the point that its bones showed through its skin, and was hunched over with long arms. The speed in which it ran across the road was way faster than any normal human could run. She was alarmed by how fast this thing moved. If this thing hadn't moved so unnaturally fast, she would have dismissed it as a person. She didn't panic though. Instead, a calming sensation came over her as whatever this was disappeared into the fields across the street from the neighborhood, and she drove home without further incident. A few months later, the OP and her friend were hanging out in a park at night. It was getting late when she heard an inhuman guttural scream off in the distance. She immediately thought back to the creature she saw crossing the road as the scream came from that direction. She didn't mention this to her friend because she was easily spooked. They both started feeling unwelcome, and as they were walking back to the car, they were facing a dark wooded area. The OP got the distinct feeling she was looking at a face in the darkness. She didn't see anything, but she could not shake the feeling that there was a face in the darkness watching her and her friend. Whatever it was did not feel human. It felt hostile to her and like it wanted them to leave the area immediately. She waited until they got in the car before she told her friend, and couldn't help but think back to the same creature she saw that one night. Fast forward a few months. She was riding in a car with a friend when she looked into the wooded area they were passing and thought she saw a white face. White as in pale, stark white. She immediately got an uneasy feeling and told her friend what she saw. He told her of rumors about people seeing beings he called White Walkers in the area. They were said to be tall and have white faces with black hair. The OP also notes that on a separate occasion she felt like something from those woods was watching her. It seems to me that these White Walkers, as the OP's friend calls them, could be crawlers. Whether it's one or more than one, the area she lives in outside of Sacramento sure seems to be a hotspot for the paranormal, especially for these pale white creatures assumed to be crawlers. Our final story of the episode comes to us from a poster who encountered a crawler in Saskatchewan, Canada. Saskatchewan is a province located in western Canada. It is bordered by Alberta on the west, the Northwest Territories to the north, and Manitoba to the east. Its southern border connects to the states of Montana and North Dakota. It is one of the only 2 landlocked provinces, and as of this year has an estimated population of just under 1.2 million. The northern portion of the province is mostly forested and sparsely populated. The original poster points out before getting into his story that he is not superstitious at all and has never believed in anything paranormal. He always tries to find a rational explanation for things, but this experience is the only thing that has ever made him even consider that something like cryptids or otherworldly forces may actually exist. His great uncle owns land in northern Saskatchewan. Some of the land was used as a pasture for cattle, but there is a large portion that is fenced off to keep the cattle from entering the area. This portion of land is covered by very dense foliage, making it nearly inaccessible, except for game trails, small clearings, and one main dirt road. The road starts at one of the main gates and extends all the way across the vast property. It goes through the portion of land with the dense foliage near some steep hills. It is in this area that there is a campsite that includes 2 campers, a larger one his mother sleeps in and a smaller one for him, a fire pit, and a table. There is a lot of wildlife in the area, which includes big cats and bears, so the OP knows how to identify sights and sounds around him. He isn't afraid of anything in the area, being that he is usually armed when he is out there alone. It was summertime and his stay at the camp began uneventfully, with him woodworking, taking fishing trips, looking for berries, and setting traps for small game such as rabbits and grouse. They always made sure to keep a bright light on at night to ward off any unwanted guests. During the second week of their stay, they began hearing noises very late at night. Their dog, who stayed outside, had to eventually be brought in at night because she would bark and carry on at the noises. They still hadn't seen anything at this point, but it felt like to him that whatever was making these noises was getting close enough to their camp at night to check things out, but was careful to stay out of the spotlight and remain hidden. They also noticed that an eerie silence would fall upon the camp at night right around the time the strange noises would pick up. One night, the OP left his mother's camper and was walking to his, but was unarmed, so he felt more vulnerable. He was looking to his right, scanning the tree line as he walked. When his eyes hit the area behind the table, he saw it standing there, not 20 feet from him. He only saw this thing for mere seconds, but it felt more like several minutes passed as he tried to process what he was looking at. The pale, almost gray, naked figure stood 6.5 to 7.5 feet tall and had a very thin, frail body with low, slumped shoulders. Its arms were long and disproportionate. He could not fully see the legs because of the table, but its skin looked like it was stretched over an extremely thin body. He could barely see the face, but it looked to have shallow features that vaguely looked like smoothed down lips, nose, and eye sockets. The sudden shock of seeing this creature sent a primal fear surging through him. It was so strong he could barely think. He took off running toward his trailer, saying that he felt like his life depended on reaching it before this thing reached him. Once inside, he grabbed his shotgun and put a few shells in his pocket. He sat with the barrel aimed at the door, waiting for this thing to come through it, but it never did. He remained there until about 4 a.m. before hesitantly going to sleep. He woke up the next day unsure if he actually saw the thing he thought he had the night before. He looked around camp to see if there was anything he could have mistaken for this creature. There was nothing. He's still not sure what he saw, but he thinks this thing was intelligent based on its behavior before he actually saw it. He thinks it was stalking him and his mother, learning their habits and routine before placing itself on the path between the two campers as a way of trapping one of them. He recalls how he heard no sound at all when this thing eventually left camp, meaning it moved around, both coming and going silently. He has since seen photos and drawings of crawlers online and says that what he saw that night closely resembles what is depicted in these images. It certainly seems like a crawler to me, but I think if it wanted to get him or his mother, it would have. If it can move that silently, there's nothing either of them could have done if it wanted to grab one of them, especially given the amount of speed these things are described as having. There's no telling what this thing was up to coming to their camp every night, and I guess we will never know. Luckily, nothing happened to the OP, his mom, or their dog. Something else that comes to my attention is how he describes it stalking them and how it plays itself on his path between the campers. The person telling the second story describes that crawler doing something similar, seemingly positioning itself in their path. These acts, if true, coupled with the fact that they could have the ability to pick up a scent, seemingly suggest that these things have intelligence and could be potential predators. I again think back to that story from Australia and fully believe that girl was being stalked by one. All of these things point to the fact that crawlers are able to track their prey. What do you think of the similarities described in these stories? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put my email in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an upcoming episode. Thank you for listening. I will catch you at the next episode.